Shalom Aleichem. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you happen to be. The woman we're going to discuss this evening is Gluckel Bas Yehuda, often referred to as Gluckel of Hamlin. We'll get to that in a moment. She is probably the most famous of the four women that we are discussing in this series. I call Glickel a philogynist. So first of all, let's discuss what phylogeny is. A way of venerating the embodiment of human attributes identifiable as feminine, physically, mentally, and spiritually. It is a personal approach to living as opposed to a position that demands political change. It is not goal-oriented, but more a set of ideals according to which one lives. Phylogeny is the opposite of misogyny. If misogyny is hostility towards women, hatred towards women, phylogeny is admiration of women, respect for women, as the definition says, even venerating women. But it is not exactly feminism, because it is, we might say, feminism without the politics. It's not demanding political change. It is a set of beliefs, ideals, convictions. This picture is not Glickel. It is Bertha Papenheim. Bertha Papenheim was an indirect descendant of Glickel. That is, she was not a great-great-great-granddaughter, but rather a great-great-great niece. Bertha Papenheim was famous in her own right. She was the Anna O, who was Dr. Joseph Breuer's patient, and a case analyzed, one of the first cases analyzed by Sigmund Freud as an example of female hysteria, an analysis that has been roundly criticized over the years. Bertha Papenheim was also a pioneer feminist. She founded the Jüdische Frauenbund, the Jewish Women's League in Germany. She fought against white slavery. She fought for women's rights. At one point in her life, she decided to dress up in 17th century costume as she imagined Glickel, her ancestor, might look. And this gives us some idea of what Glickel might have looked like. But what we know about Glickel is really this book. Before the digital age, people were told, if you want to exist, write. Writing gives you immortality. And the reason why we are discussing Glickel today is because she wrote what can be termed her memoirs. Glickel was not the only woman to write memoirs at her time. She also, certainly there were many non-Jewish women who did, and she herself mentions in her book at least one woman who also wrote about her own life. There were many women in her milieu who were literate, who were active, and we will discuss exactly what her activities were in a moment. This book she wrote beginning in 1691, 2 years after her husband Chaim died. There was no television in those days, and she was lonely in the evening, so she decided to set down her memories of her life and guidance for her children for the sake of her children. She never intended to publish these memoirs, as far as we know anyway, and one of her grandsons copied them. We don't have the original manuscript. We only had he actually made 2 copies. We have one virtually full copy and one very fragmentary copy. The memoir was initially published by the scholar David Kaufman in 1896. And after that, it had a rather checkered history. That is, it was translated twice into German, once by Bertha Papenheim and once by Alfred Feilenreich, who Bowdlerized it. And then that German translation was popularized in English by Lowenthal, Marvin Lowenthal, and that became almost a standard text in Jewish history courses, certainly in the United States and elsewhere. And that was unfortunate because it was not an accurate translation. There was a pretty good translation by Beth Zion Abrahams in the early 60s, but until Chava Turniansky in 2006 published a bilingual edition of the memoir in the original Yiddish Deutsch, that is Yiddish, Western Yiddish, and Hebrew, with notation and maps and diagrams, introduction. We can say that until Chava Turniansky's edition, we really have not read Glickel. And Turniansky's edition has been translated into English by Sarah Friedman, and this is now becoming the standard edition for coursework and teaching. And if you read the book, I think you'll find it very interesting. Now, this is what we really know about Glickel. That is, we have her signature. Today, Sunday, the 21st of Tevet, that was in 1697, I, Glickelson, widow of Reb Chaim Hamel Segal, paid my balance, thus I owe nothing more. This was in the communal Pinkas, the communal record book of Hamburg, where she paid her communal dues, her communal tax, and signed that she has executed her civil duty. What do we know about Glickel? Glickel was born in 1645 in Hamburg. At the age of 12, she married Chaim Segal, and at the age of 14, had her first child. She had 14 children in all, 12 of whom lived into adolescence at least, which is rather unusual in the 17th century, where something like 50% of children died before the age of 2. This is testimony to the fact that Chaim and Glickel were rather affluent. That is, they could afford heat, they could afford food. And those were big factors in keeping their children alive. She lived most of her life in Hamburg. However, right after they were married, they lived for a year with Chaim's parents in Hamlin, south of Hamburg. And fortuitously, everyone knows about the Pied Piper of Hamlin, so it became popular to attach Hamlin to Glickel's name as if she were from Hamlin, where in fact she lived most of her life in Hamburg with occasional visits to her in-laws in Hamlin. Chaim and Glickel were merchants. They dealt in jewels, they dealt in pearls, they dealt in fabric, they did some money lending. Whatever opportunity presented itself, they tried to exploit. As I said, they were relatively affluent. They weren't the richest Jews, they weren't court Jews, and they didn't really deal very much with court Jews. Rather, the people they dealt with were the people who dealt with court Jews. On the other hand, several of their children married into the families of court Jews. So they were certainly in what we would call today the upper, at least 10%, if not higher, of Jewish society in those days. Glickel tells us that she did spend some time in school, in Cheder, studying, and it's obvious from her writing that she is well-read in Yiddish. Natalie Zeman Davis makes the argument that she also read in German. Chaim died in 1689, after they had been married 29 years, which was a tremendous blow for Glickel. It was, as I said before, the spur for her writing her memoir. And when he died, she was left with 8 single children whose marriages she had to arrange. From her writing, we see that her chief concerns were making a living, making sure that she could make matches for her children. She was concerned with what was fashionable. She was very concerned with what she calls kavod, that is honor, getting recognition from other people. She was concerned with honesty in business, with religiosity, integrity, and reputation. She also was somewhat of a cynic as to human nature. We'll talk about that in a moment later. She, I think, was ambivalent about being a mother, that is, the one-sidedness of parenthood. Well, she was religiously punctilious. I sense conflict about religion. She is obsessed with problems of theodicy and constantly coming up with different solutions to the problem of why the righteous suffer and the evil seem to prosper. At one point, she says that she wishes she had her mother's faith, but she doesn't. What you see on the screen is the first page of the copy that her grandson made of her manuscript. I read this book as having more than one narrative on different levels. First of all, there's the narrative of prescription. That is the conventional, traditional life that she wants her children to live. She supports religious values, bourgeois values. She presents a world where God is in his heaven and is just, that husbands are the heads of the family and provide for the family. The wife should be dutiful and a devoted mother. People should be pious. However, I think there is another narrative, the narrative of experience, where she expresses her ambivalence about religion, as I mentioned a moment ago, and about parenthood, and even about her husband, and certainly about gender roles, where we'll see that she expresses an unconventional ideal of what women should be like, what women actually are like. And as far as experience, to give an example of her narrative of experience, she says at one point, if someone can ruin someone else in business, they will do it. So as an example of the narrative of prescription, she brings several women as models. What is a model woman in Glickel's world? So she discusses Pesele, who was her brother-in-law's mother. The modest Pesela. So first of all, a woman should be modest. She had no equal in the world, with the exception of our matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. There was no woman like her for religiosity and piety. Now this could describe the woman we discussed last week, Bela Falk. She lived up to this kind of ideal, and you see that this ideal still exists. However, Glickel adds that Pesela was an Eshet Chayil. Eshet Chayil. Eshet Chayil is the 31st chapter of the book of Mishlei, of Proverbs, which traditionally is taken to describe the virtues of a Jewish woman, and was in many households sung and still sung by the husband in honor of his wife at Friday night. But Eshet Chayil in our early modern sources is a technical term. An Eshet Chayil is a woman who supports her family, a woman who brings in income, a woman who may be the sole support, certainly is at least a joint support with her husband. So when you see Eshet Chayil, that means it's a woman who is a breadwinner. Another example, a relative of hers, an honest, clever woman, Bela Cohen. Bela believed that she had attained the highest degree of happiness. She was married to Ber Cohen, a great scholar, a Cohen, from a privileged family, prodigiously wealthy, good-hearted, kind to rich and poor alike. They had a very good life together. So again, this is the conventional, ideal woman. She is honest, clever, but how has she attained the highest degree of happiness? By marrying a man who is both a scholar and wealthy. But then, when Glickel talks about herself and some other women, she inserts a different note. Last week, when we discussed women's cultural status in Judaism, I mentioned the fact that in the traditional liturgy, men recite every day, blessing God for not having created them a woman, and that there's a hierarchy, angels, men, women, that it's better to be a man than a woman, while women recite the blessing, blessing God for making me according to your will. And Yaakov ben Asher, the author of the halachic work, the Arba Turim, says this is a tziduk hadin. That is making your peace with misfortune. Well, Glickel doesn't think it's a misfortune to be a woman. And she declares proudly, I thank and praise my Creator that he created me as he desired and saw fit. So she takes some of the same words of the blessing, but she makes it clear that this is not a misfortune. This is something positive. This is something good to be a woman. And then she mentions, my father provided an education in the ways of heaven as well as in the ways of the world to both his sons and his daughters. As I mentioned before, Glickel was highly educated. She was well-read, certainly in Yiddish. She was also initiated into the ways of business and the economy. Her father made sure that his daughters were as well educated as his sons. So, Glickel does not feel any inferiority being a woman. She can match her brothers, she can match her husband, she can match any man, both in the spiritual realm and in the worldly realm. As part of my thesis of phylogeny, you see in many places in the memoir where Glickel tells us women's lives matter. What women think, what women do, what women say is important. So for example, I gave birth every 2 years and worked very hard, as is the way of anyone with a household with children. Raising a family, being a mother, being a homemaker is hard work. It's not any less hard than what a man does. And in a different context, she talks about the fact that when she was pregnant, she had a taste for medlars. Medlars is a European fruit, something like loquat or apricots. She had a taste for it, and for whatever reason, she wasn't able to buy the medlars when she had a taste for them. But in the end, when the baby was born and there were problems with the baby, she did procure some medlars, and these medlars cured the baby of his problem. And to that she says, from this we see that what women desire is not pure stupidity. So don't make fun of women's whims. Or, speaking of Bela, she says, Bela knew how to guide the heart of her husband. That is, Bela was a partner with her husband. Bela had a part in her husband's decisions. It was a partnership. That's what a marriage should be. Women have something to say. Now, we're all familiar with the term objectification, how women are objectified often by men, by the male gaze. To me, it's very interesting that Glickel includes in her memoir an anecdote of how she was with her husband and children in Emden, and then they went somewhere else. They were in Emden for Rosh Hashanah, and then they were somewhere else, and they had to get back to Hamburg after Yom Kippur. And there were pirates on the waterways, and a war between France and Holland on the land, and it was risky to travel back to Hamburg, but they had to get back. So a friend of theirs arranged for them to go back by land with an armed guard. And the friend's name was Meir Aurich. And he was seeing them off. And when he saw that the women, that is Glickel and her maid, were wearing old clothes that made them look poor and ugly, he said to Chaim, Glickel's husband, "My dear Reb Chaim, why are you so worried? Why are you making your wife dress so hideously?" My husband answered, "God knows I'm not worried about myself or the money I'm carrying. It's the women folk I'm worried about, my wife and the maidservant." In other words, he's afraid the women will be sexually assaulted along the way. Said Reb Meir, "No need to worry. Seriously, Reb Chaim, you're wrong about your wife. You should not have made her dress so hideously. Nobody would have harmed her anyway. In other words, your wife is ugly." My husband was very angry at Reb Meir's joking and took it very much to heart. The way I read this is Glickel is saying objectification is the men's problem. She has no comment. She has no, she's not defensive in any way. She's not critical. She just tells it as something that bothered her husband, but not her. Objectification is the men's problem, not hers. Glickel also makes a point of highlighting women in her memoir who have agency, who make decisions, who solve problems, who do things on their own. So for example, she discusses how my mother had some business with an advocate who lived in the horse market. Or, let's get to the bottom here. On Simchat Torah in 1714, there was a fight in the Ezrat Nashim in the town of Metz, where by that time Glickel was living in Metz with her second husband. And the fight was one woman mentioned to another that she thought she was being disrespectful or haughty in the way she was carrying herself. And the women started fighting. They were jostling each other. They tore their head coverings one from the other. And then the men started fighting. That is, the husbands of the women who were fighting took their wives' sides and started fighting with the other husbands. By Shavuot of 1715, there was a tragedy in the synagogue. There were noises in the women's gallery, and some people started shouting that the gallery was collapsing. And so the women stampeded out. It was a narrow staircase, and 6 women were trampled to death, and other women were injured. This was a great tragedy, of course, and Glickel tries to find the reason for it. And she goes back to what happened on Simchat Torah, the previous Simchat Torah, the fight of the women in the women's gallery. She believed led to the women being punished by the collapse, but actually it did not collapse, by the false alarm of a collapse of the women's gallery. Then she tells us that righteous women established a Psalms recital society, hiring 10 scholars to go to the synagogue every day at 9 a.m. to say Tehillim and study. So, of course, in those days, women themselves wouldn't be the ones to go to the synagogue every day to say Tehillim and study in memory of the tragedy, but these women took the initiative to hire men to do that. Another example, when they were traveling, when Glickel and her family were traveling somewhere, the widow Breinele, another relative of theirs, was a most devout, wise woman. She did all she could to help us continue on our journey. That is, she made the arrangements for them to continue on their journey. When reading Glickel, the question comes to my mind, did she think that women really need men, aside from having children? Of course, it's clear that she really loved Chaim, but once he died, she claimed there was no need for her to get married, and she was not the only one. My sister-in-law Yenta remained a widow for several years, unwilling to remarry since she was a young, energetic woman. What does this tell us? If you are a young, energetic woman, if you have ideas, if you have goals, if you are active in certain ways, you don't want to be responsible to a man. We mentioned last week, it's been said many times that certainly in the early modern period, the most autonomous, most empowered, most independent women were affluent widows. We can assume that Yenta, being Glickel's sister-in-law, was part of the more affluent families in society. And for her, it was, at least for several years, preferable not to be married. When my father died, Glickel says, my mother was 44 years old, the same age that Glickel was, by the way, when Chaim died. She had opportunities for many good matches and could have remarried and had great wealth again. So one benefit of being married is to gain wealth. But she never wanted that, preferring instead to remain a widow. If God punishes a woman and she loses her first husband, may the good Lord also give her this thought. My mother remained in her dignified widowhood. A woman independent of a man is dignified. And Glikl herself, after Chaim died in 1689, for 11 years, she remained single. And she tells us, many matches had indeed been proposed to me, the most prestigious in all Ashkenaz. But as long as I thought I could manage to live on the little that my husband left me, I never even considered changing my status. And she says she saw no advantage to her children to her remarrying. She would only remarry if it would help her children in some way. Well, in 1700, her son-in-law convinced her that she could remarry and help her children as well as herself. So in 1700, she married the richest Jew in Alsace, a court Jew who dealt in army purveying and lending money to the army in France, as well as other businesses. His name was Hertz or Hirsch, in French, Serf Levy. So, being so wealthy, Glickel was convinced that, first of all, she would not have to work anymore. And secondly, through him, her children would establish all sorts of business, commercial connections and be able to succeed. So she agreed to marry Hertz or Hirsch Levy. And at first, everything went as planned. She talks about how she came for the betrothal, the engagement. My husband's valet came in with the maidservant bearing 2 big gold-plated trays, one with the fanciest desserts, the other with the choicest fruits. Lying on top was a gold chain with a gold bar and 2 large gold-plated goblets filled with wine. This was my Sabbath fruit. It was exquisite. So certainly an exhibition of ostentatious wealth. Serf Levy was indeed a very, very wealthy man, and everything looked like it would have a happy ending. However, Glickel writes, but oh, dear Lord and Maker, that gold chain turned literally into shackles and bands of iron. Why is that? Because Hertz Levy had the chutzpah to go bankrupt and not only lose his own money, but to lose much of Glickel's money. As she laments, I had to fall into the hands of a man. And she says what she should have done, instead of remarrying, she should have married off her youngest daughter, the final child who was unmarried, and then done what Bela Falk did. Go to Eretz Yisrael and live a pious life, visiting the graves of righteous people, praying, studying, and being in the atmosphere of the Holy Land. That's what she says she should have done. But instead, she fell into the hands of a man. He went bankrupt. She wound up living with one of her daughters and a son-in-law, which she hated, the idea that she had to be dependent on her child. Another hint as to Glickel's attitudes towards men and women is the following. Who are the villains in this book? All of the villains, at least all of them that I could find, are men. Reb Moshe Helmstedt was a pompous, obese, staffed, arrogant, wicked man. He would have 10 to 12,000 Reichstaler of ours on hand, never worrying about the money not being his own or having to return it. That is, Chaim Segal would go into partnership with this Moshe Helmstedt, who did deal with court Jews. So he would invest 10 to 12,000 Reichstaler with him, and Helmstedt was supposed to take the money and invest it in some commercial deal. But this Helmstedt, he wanted to enjoy the money while it was there, buying a fancy carriage and the best horses. He kept 2 or 3 servants. He lived like a prince. The pompous fool, once he got his hands on good Reb Chaim Hamel's money, could not control himself any longer. He arrived in Berlin, started rattling the money. In other words, he started being a big spender in Berlin. His creditors, Jews and non-Jews, people he owed money to from previous deals, heard that he finally had some money, and they had him arrested so that he would pay his debts. And poor Chaim lost his money. Another villain. Glickel tells us that her son, Yosef, was a gifted student, and she felt he should study in Poland, where the serious yeshivot were. So he had had a tutor in Hamburg, and the tutor was Polish, took him with him to Leszno, or Lisa, a city in western Poland, to study. And this teacher, he played around somewhat with the tuition, but Glickel didn't think that was a big problem. But then she got a letter, ostensibly from her son, saying that the city fathers of Leszno decided to foreclose on the loans of the Jewish community of Leszno. And in order to get the Jewish community to pay, they were going to take all of the foreign students, like Glickelson, who was from Germany, and hold them for ransom until their parents would pay money to have them freed, and that would cover the debts of the Leszno Jewish community. So the letter said, please send money so that I can leave before I'm taken into custody by the city of Leszno. Well, Glickel was in a panic when she got this letter, and she sent one of her other sons to rescue her son Yosef from Leszno. The son who went to rescue his brother stopped on the way in Frankfurt an Oder, and by chance met Yosef, who was coming from Leszno. When Yosef arrived safely in Hamburg and Glickel showed him this letter, he said, "My teacher must have written it in order to get money. He took all my belongings, cut the silver buttons off my coat, and pawned it. When I asked him to return my things, he accused me of spending it all to satisfy my greedy sweet tooth and said I had pawned it all for myself. Thanks be to God that I got away from that scoundrel, since he taught me nothing anyway." So another villain, the Torah teacher of Yosef Segal. And a third villain. One of Glickel's sons, Leib, was what we would call, what my grandparents would call a lo yutzlach, somebody who just can't succeed. Glickel helped set him up into business. He got married to a girl in Berlin and opened a store, but he was a very poor businessman, and he owed a lot of money that he couldn't cover. At first, Glickel was not aware of his business problems. Eventually, one of her acquaintances who had been in Berlin came to Hamburg and warned her of what was happening. And he said, "Reb Wolf comes to Leib's store every single day and takes what your son Leib sees and what he does not see. Leib also has business dealings with Poles, that is Jewish Poles. And I happen to know that he lost more than 4,000 Reichsdaler in a short time doing business with them." Glickel says, "I nearly dropped dead. I fainted dead away then and there." So, more male villains like Reb Wolf and these Jewish Polish merchants who are cheating her son, who is rather feckless. But then we get to the heroes. Who are the heroes of the book? Glickel's father had been married before he married her mother, and his first wife had a daughter. This stepdaughter knew French. Glickel's father lent money, and some men, non-Jewish men, had given him a pawn for a 500 Reichstaler loan. They came to the house to ostensibly pay back the debt and get their pawn. When they got to the house, Glickel's father went upstairs to get the pawn that they had left. And in the meantime, the stepdaughter, who did know French, was playing the pianoforte to entertain these guests. And she overheard them speaking in French. They said, "When the Jew comes back with our pledge, we'll grab it without giving him the money and get out of here." Well, the daughter heard this, and when Glickel's father came back with the pledge, ready to give it to them, she yelled, "Lo amashkin, hayom v'kan, machar v'yivrach." Beware, not the pledge. Today here, tomorrow gone. And Glickel's father understood that he wasn't giving them any pledge back until he saw the money. So, the stepdaughter is the hero. When the people with the loan said, "We've been duped. The whore must know French." Another hero is Rebecca the detective. Here is a map of Hamburg. This is a rather complicated story. To try to simplify it, 2 different Jewish money changers went missing 3 years apart, and no one knew what happened to them. At some point, other money changers came forward and said that the servant of a certain man, a woman servant, had come to them with gold and said that there is some foreign merchant who wants to sell lots of gold. Bring 6,000, or rather 600 Reichstaler, and you can buy it from him. And the money changers who testified to this didn't have the 600 to go with her. So this woman, Rebecca, realized that what happened was that these 2 men did have the money, did go with her, and were killed. She understood that the master of this maidservant was the one who killed these men when they came to him ostensibly to buy the gold. She was sure that he was the culprit. She saw him with the servant carrying a chest. She was convinced that one of the dead bodies was in the chest. It turned out it wasn't. But she tricked the servant into confessing about what happened, and they found the bodies of both the dead Jews, and they were given Jewish burial. So another Jewish woman who is a hero. And the real hero of the book is, in my opinion, Glickel. When Chaim was on his deathbed and they asked him, what instructions do you want to leave so that we can continue your business? He said, my wife, she knows everything. She should continue just as she was doing before. She was my partner. She knows the business. I have no special instructions. She knows what to do. Or another place she says, it is not to praise myself that I mentioned that he took advice from no one but me, that is, Chaim took advice from no one but her, and did nothing until we had talked it over. One might say she was the brains of the operation. Though my husband did not want to tell me, he could not keep it from me. When he made a bad deal, he had to confess to her. Or when someone offered him a certain deal, I said to my husband, we can try it for 1 year, a certain partnership. I will draft a short agreement and see how it suits you. So she was the one to draw up the agreement. Or then she tells us that once when she was traveling and her husband couldn't go with her, he hired someone named Yaakov to be a chaperone for her and the children. But this Yaakov liked liquor, and he left them to go get a drink in the tavern while they continued their journey. Finally, 2 villagers found my Yaakov as good as dead, faint with travel and drunkenness, his money all gone. So the villagers brought him to the inn. Despite being furious with him, I thanked God upon seeing him again. It cost me more than 7 Reichstaler because she had to pay the villagers. I gave him something to eat. So my fine servant, who was supposed to be taking care of me and my children, I wound up taking care of him instead. Or she tells us about the business she was doing in Hamburg. This is the Hamburg market. I was doing a brisk business in the fabric trade, selling 500 or 600 Reichsdollars worth of goods a month. I attended the Braunschweig fair twice a year, making several thousand at every fair. My fabric business was doing very well indeed. I imported merchandise from Holland and purchased a large quantity of merchandise in Hamburg too, and I sold it. I had my own fabric store. Winter and summer, I traveled constantly on the go. In addition, I dealt in ounce pearls, which I would buy from the Jews, and then I'd sort them and resell them wherever I knew there was demand. I had an extended line of credit. If I wanted to make 20,000 Reichsdollar banco during a single bourse session, I could do it. She was a successful businesswoman, totally on her own. And then, as I mentioned before, one of her babies was born with brown blotches. She sent for the medlars. They rubbed the baby's lips with the medlars, and miraculously the blotches went away, and he started thriving. So to sum up, Glickel was neither a misanthrope, nor a misogynist, nor a feminist. She was, I submit, a philogynist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rosman. We'll start with one question, and this is the time if you have some other questions. So Tzipi wants to know what happened to her children and grandchildren after her death. Are there any descendants of hers today? We spoke about her great niece, but I think she's asking about her direct descendants.
I don't know for sure. I believe there are. For example, that picture of Bertha Papenheim was from the family of Professor Alice Shalvey, and I believe that they are somehow connected to this.
Really?
And her children have their own careers. She does not say anything about grandchildren, interestingly enough. One of her grandchildren notoriously converted to Christianity, I think in 1711 in London. So he's viewed as the black sheep of the family, but one of the most famous people of her descendants for that reason. The others have their own careers, but I can't talk about that tonight.
Let's see, Susan is asking if you could give again the information about the translation of the book. I believe it was translated by Sarah Friedman. Right?
Yes, with close supervision by Chava Turniansky. They really collaborated on the translation.
Can you tell us how unique was it, her writing, compared to other women in her time, Jewish and Gentiles?
Well, if we have really, well, we presume that there were other women who wrote similarly, Jewish women. We have no other examples of that. The only Jewish women's writing we have from approximately the same time is Rivka Tichtiner. I think I mentioned it last week, Menekes Rivka, who wrote a morality book telling women how they should behave. So it's much different than this. However, Natalie Zeman Davis, in her book Women on the Margins, compared Glickel's writing to 17th century non-Jewish women. And there are many similarities in the kinds of motifs that they use, the themes that they pick, the way they describe things. She is very much a woman of her age, not only in the way she writes. For example, when her oldest daughter, Zipporah, married the son of Elia Klev Gompertz, a court Jew who was very wealthy. Glickel describes the wedding ceremony and the wedding party and how fashionable it was, how they had all kinds of foreign fruit and the decor with leather wallpaper and the guests. The guests were royalty, the prince and the prince's son. There was so much excitement over these non-Jewish guests that they forgot to write the ketubah, and they had to make a pledge that the ketubah would be written after the ceremony. And then she talks about the entertainment, that they had dancers, and they presented what's called the Dance of the Dead, which was a popular dance at the time, not just among Jews, obviously. So she was very much a person of her time.
Okay. Rob wants to know if you could comment on what the scholarship says about the fidelity of her son's copy of her memoirs. Is it true or just a commentary on her memoirs?
Well, since we don't have the original, it's very difficult to be definitive. I think the consensus is that he was as loyal to the original as could be. In any copy, there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be scribal errors. It does not seem that he injected himself very much into it. Now, often a copyist will omit things, especially if we're talking about his grandmother. He might omit things that are considered embarrassing. We don't know if he omitted things or not.
True.
Do you want to give us a hint to who we'll be meeting next week?
Yes. Next week is the cultural capitalist. That is Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah Horowitz, who lived in the 18th century. Her friends called her Leah Horowitz. And she wrote a small booklet in 3 languages, Hebrew, Yiddish, and Aramaic. She was an unusually learned woman for her age. And her basic message is women deserve to be full cultural partners in Judaism. This was in the 18th century, and that's what we will discuss.